How's it going, everyone? Today is February 2nd. I'm here once again with my lovely co-host Boomer, and we have a pretty cool show for you today. We're going to be talking about all the employment numbers. Maybe that's not super fun for some of you guys,
Very exciting.
but we're going to dive into what exactly is driving this massive surge of employment in the US that does not really feel right if you're somebody working in the technology space. That might not feel right at all if you work any job that's not a government job. Yet the data is showing that everyone's getting jobs left and right. And the higher for longer crowd when it comes to rates are going to be able to pat themselves on the back a little bit because of that. We're going to talk about now the Bitcoin ETFs have been around for, I don't know, almost a month, where all that money is gone. Bitcoin's been very flat for the whole month. And lastly, we're going to dive into this almost emergency order / teetering on some surveillance state stuff with Bitcoin mining going down to the US and what that could potentially implicate for the future of miners in America. So yeah, Boomer, how's your week been so far?
Never a dull week. Never a dull week. Especially like in election years. I guess I'd like to look at that to see previous US election years, just how crazy the news is. Because it's just nonstop, right?
I will say for an election year, it's been boring so far. Like they've
Really?
really tried in the media to drum up the whole, could Trump win the nomination? He's got, Haley being funded by Democrats. It's like I don't think there's ever, at least in my lifetime, I've never seen someone walk away with the nomination as easy as he has. They're still, Haley's still in it for some reason. I don't know why, but I don't know. It's boring on that front. And what that means is because that whole thing's going to wrap up early, you're just going to have months of not really much going on before the conventions that happen in the summer and then the 3 months leading up to the general election. I think someone said, I heard the other day, that if Trump or if Haley drops out this month, which is pretty likely, it will be the longest general election campaign in like 40 years in America. So
Well, I'm talking about like just in the news. Like there's always stuff in the news. Like, yeah, maybe there's not a ton of stuff, debates of parties and people for that type of stuff. But just in the economy, there's always stuff in the economy. There's always something to talk about. Always, always, always.
Mm-hmm.
That seems exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. And election years are pretty good years for the market in general.
Yes.
I guess they're pretty good years for Bitcoin. Usually Bitcoin is making all-time highs in election years somewhere near the end. It's happened now, I think, 3 elections in a row that Bitcoin has made new all-time highs. So
but
this
that
year
I think has,
if it hasn't.
But I think that's more of a function of the halving cycle than it is the election cycle.
Do you think that was intentional at all on Satoshi's behalf?
Maybe.
I bet you the halving cycles will stick to their sanctioned year longer than the election cycles will stay on an every 4-year format.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, by 2140, I think American democracy is going to be a little different than it is today.
By 2040. Right?
All right. E.R. Berg says Haley is still in it to keep the Republican Party divided. Yeah, I don't know the game plan there. I made a tweet and I said it's money laundering at this point. Like she has no chance to win, but people are willing to keep funneling money into her campaign. She can pay her staffers. She can pocket a little bit on the side for herself. Embezzlement is actually probably the right word. That's my theory on the whole thing. I mean, why not? If she's being paid to stay in, why not just stay in? So she'll drop out when the money drops out.
She could be playing for the next election year, right?
Every
4 years from now, she's still quite young.
Every minute that she stays in, I think, kills her chances with like
for the next one, though. Like I'm not talking about 2024. I'm talking about 2028.
No, I know, but I think by her staying and being kind of like stubborn and not getting behind Trump, I think that actually hurts her long-term prospects. Although people forget stuff, it's considered not good to like overstay your welcome. Like DeSantis kind of, bowed out. I think if he stayed in, it would have looked bad on him too. But this isn't a political show. I'm Canadian. We're Canadian. We don't know anything about this stuff. It's just like watching the game, right?
Okay. Bread and circus.
All right. So I'm gonna splash a whole bunch of data here. You are deeper into economics than I am. I'm just looking at the stuff superficially from a Twitter standpoint, from a feeling standpoint. but we're going to talk about this jobs mystery here in the US. And I'm going to bring up a couple charts here. The first one that we have is we have this big surprise to the upside here in January. All these jobs created, uh, the highest monthly change in jobs since basically the same time last year, blowing kind of expectations out of the water. The biggest growth in these jobs was in the education and health services sector, professional and business services, and then big declines in mining and logging. Labor force participation rate, which is how many people are actively out in the labor force, stayed pretty much the same or low. And then I want to bring up some articles here talking about how these jobs numbers are really, where they're really coming from, and why maybe there was a bit of a surprise here. So this is a Wall Street Journal article, Jobs Mystery, where are all the new jobs coming from? And despite adding a record number of jobs, 2.9 million jobs over the past 12 months, the unemployment rate hasn't really changed. And I think part of that is because there's essentially two different forms of collecting employment data and who's working and who's not. There is something called a household survey, which is going to households and seeing, who works and who doesn't. And then there's going direct to the employers and seeing their trends, how much have they increased their workforce versus not. Do I have that right, Boomer? Is that approximately how they work?
Yep.
Cool.
So an important little nuance too.
Sorry, I missed that.
That's an important nuance.
Yeah. Why is that an important nuance?
Because it can be quite different. One can, if you're asking employers if they have any vacancies or not, right? That'll lag differently than if you ask people. It also matters for multiple job holders, right? There's just it's quite different. The data will show up quite different. Over the long run, they should kind of converge, but you will notice differences.
The data point that I saw too is that the household survey going around asking people, what their jobs are like. It's a much smaller sample size than the employers. They sometimes go direct to data and they get like a full sample.
Yeah, there you go.
So the household employment has grown at about a third of the pace of payroll gains, which doesn't really seem to make a ton of sense. And there's a lot of like different factors at play. One of the big ones is, in my opinion, this great video, and I'll try and link it somewhere here. Peter St. Onge, who's a great economist, and he does some fantastic videos, talks about this thing called the welfare industrial complex. And I ended up having a short, I'll be posting that in the next couple of weeks, kind of about this. But it's this idea, I'll share my thing here. It's this idea that so many new jobs, because of things like the fentanyl crisis, because of an increase in homelessness, and because of the crazy migration stuff going down in the US, so many of these new jobs have been not created in the private sector, but rather the government just trying to get a stranglehold on some of these challenges. And what you're getting is massive increases in public sector jobs. So people working in, as social workers, for instance, tons of new migration officers. They're having trouble finding enough migration officers to handle, all the cases that they have to handle. People working in the judicial system to manage all these things. And just overall government jobs have massively increased. And there's like a very clear dichotomy as to who is benefiting from this. But in the unemployment and the employment data, it shows up as like the whole country. You have these more right-wing states like Texas, North Carolina, Indiana, Florida, which are showing about a 40% share in total net new jobs being from government social assistance and healthcare. But then you have states like Michigan, Illinois, New York, where I don't even know how this is possible. Over 100+% of total net new jobs are coming from the public sector. So how do you figure that? How does that actually even work? How can over 100% of net new jobs be coming from one specific sector even?
The private sector is losing jobs.
Right.
So you're negative in the private sector and the public sector is making up for it and then some.
So I'm curious, we don't have the same sort of border crisis in Canada as they do, down in the United States and what's going on there. But have you noticed that much in Canada similarly? It feels like we've also increased public sector jobs at a much bigger pace than private sector jobs here.
Yeah. Yeah, and but this is a trend that's been happening for a little while,
Hmm.
right? I don't know the exact numbers, but since 2018, the public sector has increased by a factor of 50% in Canada.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
It's significant.
But yeah, so the whole term here, it sounds interesting. Welfare industrial complex kind of evokes the military industrial complex. Um, People have these theories. There's this one called the Great Replacement theory. There's a whole bunch of theories on why the governments are being very lenient on migration, giving migrants a lot of social services that they don't even give to citizens down in some of these states.
Yeah.
There are conspiracies around, oh, they're trying to increase their permanent voter base to secure power. I don't know if it's as explicit as that, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's a welcomed side effect of some of this stuff. But man, like I can't even begin to capture. I don't want to make this show all about the migration crisis and whatnot. But the thing that really troubles me with all this, and especially as it pertains, we can talk about it in an economic sense, how it impacts the job market. But from a humanitarian level, having these open borders, it creates so many malincentives from like the worst types of people in the world to essentially profiteer off of it. The coyotes in places like Mexico are making billions and billions of dollars. I think the average cost to traffic a migrant through the south of Mexico to the north of Mexico is somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000. So you're getting people who are basically working in some of these countries for $2 minimum wages, and they're saving up $15,000. They're hustling their asses off to save up $15,000 that go direct into the pockets of coyotes who are massively profiting off this to essentially just bust them through really treacherous and dangerous routes, sleeping, in shelters, really rough stuff through Mexico, all the way up to the American border, getting them across as easily as possible, and then they're finding placement instantly. They're going in these buses to some of these states. In the beginning, a lot of them were getting settled in Texas and Arizona, but now that they've kind of reached capacity, they're just flying people and sending buses up to all these blue states. And you're seeing a bit of blowback now finally from the blue states, like this is beyond the capacity that we can handle. But where this whole idea of like the welfare industrial complex comes in is when you look at the numbers of what it costs to actually service a landed migrant, or someone who just kind of needs that social support. In Los Angeles, they found that housing units were being developed, and the net cost to build a one-bedroom housing unit that could house basically one migrant was $837,000 American. They would spend $5 billion to build a couple hundred shelters, and that would be the per housing cost, per unit cost. And then when you look at the cost of social services, things like healthcare processing, giving migrants phones, maybe food stamps, things like that, the states like New York were spending about $147,000 a year per migrant, right? Like that money in any part of like rural America could basically satisfy the living needs of 3 to 5 people. But the states, because that's the state has to administer all this stuff because they're not legally migrated into the country, there ends up being in what I think is just a ton of grift. It should not cost that much to provide shelter, to provide basic economic needs. And so maybe the government is overpaying just a bunch of individual contractors, but in my opinion, I think a lot of it is just like the military industrial complex, where a ton of it is being scraped off the top. There are people in the 1% who are benefiting from this. Maybe they provide a certain service like housing, construction companies getting certain contracts, food corporations that are getting a whole bunch from this sort of stuff too, through like the stamp programs down there. But it's rough, and I think it really distorts economic reality. It has a very real human cost to it too. It creates malincentives for people to just come to the country expecting all these benefits. And then in the end, and I don't know, when someone illegally migrates into a country, I don't know if their plan is to eventually become a citizen or to, you know, come in there, work as hard as they can, and then send the money back home. But all in all, like all the giveaways here are really, really rough. And eventually you start seeing the third order effects, which are these migrants, because of the overflow, happen to be housed in community recreation centers. So then Americans who are paying their tax money to use these recreation centers can't even use them
Yeah.
because they're being used to house migrants. And you're told to sit back, shut up, and have empathy. And if you say anything otherwise, you're being, xenophobic or bigoted or whatever. Um, but the people that these governments are supposed to represent are just having no say in any of this. And now you're seeing, these convoys going down to the border. So I've been rattling on a lot about this. I'm just curious your take on it, and I guess what you do, and if you think this might be the defining, I guess, issue of this election cycle.
Well, the first thing, the jobs data, keep in mind that it's January data.
Mm-hmm.
January data is traditionally the worst month for accuracy in anything, because it's just hard. January is a weird month. So saying that the jobs were well above expectations, the expectations weren't good. And that's kind of that, and that is normal. You'll see that with every other type of data, and that has a lot to do with December being a weird month because of the holidays and stuff. So it's always difficult to get a good grasp on what January is.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you. Definitely. I don't know the exact number. How many migrants per month? I think it's 300,000 migrant. I don't even know what the proper term is, but interventions at the border, if that's what they're called, per month. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
just Texas. And this has been going on for a while. Like, this has been going on for a couple of years now. And there is only so much that an economy can handle, right? Like, you keep putting people in, things are going to change. You mentioned recreation centers. Like, yeah, hotels as well. People are in the people in Chicago and in other some of these sanctuary cities where they're housing all these migrants are converting things that were used for other purposes to help these people. And that's going to have some, third and fourth order effects. And when the funding stops, then what? What's going to happen? Like, if we were able, are we just going to keep it going forever? I don't know how this works. Like, from what I understand, a lot of these people that cross the border, they're given housing, they're given support, but only for a set amount of time. And each state has different rules, right? For some states, it might be 90 days. For other states, it might be 120. For some, it's only 30. So what happens after that? Do these people just go to the next place and then the next place and the next place and just bounce around until they settle themselves into a job? And it's winter right now. Like, I generally speak, and I speak a little bit more for Canada, but I'm sure it's the same for the United States. The agricultural sector has been a place where, migrant workers have tended to work. But in the winter, that's not happening until a while. I don't know. This is a strange thing, and there is no good answer for this.
One of the fastest growing sectors outside kind of these like government and social working jobs is the leisure and hospitality sector. And I think if I was to gander, I would say that's where a lot of migrants are finding work. So
Yes,
that would count,
makes sense.
restaurants or just basic kind of like guest services. The challenge with this is like they're facing the same economic picture as the rest of
As everyone
Americans,
else.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like the wages are better. The wages are a lot better than what they were being paid in their countries. And maybe if they get like a really good housing situation, they're able to save up and then send some back home. But it creates this like duration, mismatch in terms of opportunity, especially for people in America that don't have, a lot of education. Now you're competing with people who are hungry, who really, really need to work to make it by, and it makes your prospects a lot harder if you don't have degrees and certifications and qualifications. There's this really weird irony to this, which I haven't seen a lot of people point out too, is, and this would apply for Canada too, because we've had a pretty pro-immigration stance, but a lot of it's been legal immigration, people coming here through and getting a real process. We have an asylum uptick here, but not like in the US.
No.
And you have all these workers that are coming here and we're placing them in the economy. But at the same time, they won't let people transfer over a ton of certifications to get good paying jobs here. if you're an engineer in Germany, like like a family friend who's an engineer, mechanic, and he still can't transfer over all his credentials from Germany over to Canada. They want to make him retake the Red Seal and all that stuff to do this. And it's the same with like doctors and dentists. Like you can't work as a doctor in Canada unless you have your classic 8-year degree. Um, and yet we want all these people in, and a lot of the governments and the statists say it's like, well, it's because we need to make up for the shortfall in the birth rate. They've been very open about this, that like that is the policy behind the mass migration. We need our population to expand because we have ever growing fiat debts to pay off, and we need to collect those tax dollars from somewhere.
And it's
So we need
rational.
that. Yeah.
It's rational.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can't really, I mean, it's funny, like Japan tried to do an advertising campaign to get their birth rate up. Didn't really work too well. They encouraged everyone to start drinking more alcohol. Didn't really have an impact. But yeah, governments have given up on trying to get people to have more kids. It's not going to be possible because so much of that decision is tied to our economic and financial well-being. And you just can't that's such like a long-term fix that needs to happen to change people's mindsets around that. So the migration is sort of like the hot fix on the leaky boat, and at the same time, they don't want to actually make it easier to work in a bunch of different sectors here. They still want everybody to go through their certification process. And maybe the mindset there is like, oh, well, if they're going to come here, if they really want to, they'll go through the school system to get their degree all over again. And then we can collect some money there. And that's better than just letting them start working right away. But then what you have is you have the massive problems that you get from that, which is like our healthcare system's just like completely crushed by all this new inflow. And yet the governments are unwilling to make it easier for medical workers to come to the country and start taking up employment. So I don't know. I don't get it. There's no sensibility in this. They always ask that question, like, are politicians and some of these people, are they evil or stupid? And that's the pessimistic way of looking at it. But I can't figure out for the life of me what the game plan is here.
How about short-sighted instead of evil or stupid? Option 3, short-sighted.
Short-sighted. But it's there at the same time. There is to me a maliciousness, which is like the lack of empathy in the terrible incentives you create by doing this. It's like there's no scope. They're just not seeing what is going on. And like this guy, Andrew Callahan, he has this channel called Channel 5 News. He used to do this show called All Gas, No Breaks. And kid's like 25 years old. He does these great on the ground documentaries, and he's just going to the borders and he's interviewing migrants. And the stories are like horrifying. But the things that are crazy is like, they're not all just from Latin America. Like a lot are. You're getting people from like Somalia coming over here, Nigeria, Chad. Like they're just getting on these boats. And the craziest thing is like, I guess Mexico doesn't care. They just let people like dock up there and then just walk across the country because I guess they know that they're not going to settle in Mexico. But yeah, it's wild to me, and it's sad. And I keep thinking like, whenever I look at these social issues, I don't know about you, I always try and think like, okay, if I was in a position of power and I was like a dictator, like what would I do as a solution? And I can't think of anything, honestly, besides like deportations. Like this is such a messaging based impulse. And so you almost have to counter the message. You can't just say, we're shutting the borders down, because eventually when your power gets turned over, the next guy opens the borders again, just like what happened with Trump. And then the process restarts. And so it's like, maybe I haven't thought this enough through personally, but if I was in a situation of power, I think that's what would have to happen, is you would have to basically get really strong with your messaging and say, the American dream is not for people who don't go through the process. I would make the process maybe easier to migrate into a country, but you have to send a message that like, you do not come here illegally under any circumstance, because no other country would tolerate it, like Mexico, maybe because they're letting people pass through there, but like try illegally immigrating to China. Forget it.
And it's hard to immigrate. It's hard to legally immigrate to a country, right? It really is hard. Like you got to go through a lot of processes. You got to get your work visas, make sure that you have the skills that are needed in that country. And when you see what's happening in the US going on right now, it disincentivizes people to do the right way.
Hmm.
And I'm empathetic to the poor people that want a better life. I feel awful for them. Like I get it. Like I really do. I really get it. I really do. But like you said, it's creating the wrong incentives, and we're rewarding bad behavior.
Yep.
I don't know which politician said it, but he said like big gates, closed
Hmm.
walls, but big gates. Like it might have been George W. Bush or something, and that always made sense to me. It's like, yes, you should be welcoming to outsiders, but there should be rules.
Hmm.
Because like you said, there's rules everywhere else.
Yeah. I think it's just like America was built on this massive risk and experiment of accepting everyone and anyone more than any other country at the time into their empire. And then through the means of capitalism, providing them with more opportunity than any other country ever has for, newly landed immigrants ever. Um, that sounds like American propaganda, but it's kind of true. And that's
Yeah,
that's the great American experiment, is like letting people in. But I think it's been changed dramatically into how that process is done. And a lot of people, they like to compare, and they say, hey, we're being so hard on like immigrants, but don't we like remember, 100, 200 years ago, it was a bunch of Irish people coming on boats here with like not a penny to their name, and not with like any ID, and we let them in and we handled it then. Why can't we handle it now? Like, I get that sentiment a little bit. There's a lot more nuance to it that those people are missing. We're in a drastically different economy now. Back then, there weren't even half the cities that existed, that exist today. But I rest my case. I think yeah, it's sad. It's frustrating. It's gonna reach a boiling point, and it's interesting because, like, I'm not, I don't love Trump, but he's been talking about this for a very long time, and he's kind of been right about, some stuff in that sense. Like, I think some of the rhetoric he uses is wrong, but he's made a really good course in that case, in that if you don't have secure borders, then you don't really have a country, and you don't have an identity. And then beyond that, the data is off. And I think that's been the story of this administration, is like they've been using data points that are not organic to their favor, whether it is, the unemployment data that's been tilted from, massive migrant expansion, whether it's the whole like, oh, we created a record amount of jobs, even though like half of them were just recovered jobs from COVID,
yeah,
or, oh, inflation is going down, when it's just the rate of change is going down, not
yeah.
the prices. It's just, and maybe I just wasn't attuned to all these things under Trump and under Obama and Bush, but it just feels like so much data manipulation under this administration. And who knows? I bet you Trump will be doing the same thing if he gets in. I think he'll probably get in November. But
Do you
it's
think?
sad. I guess that's what they say: fourth turning, end of an empire. Everyone's just running on lies. It's
Do,
it's sad.
do you think Trump like really putting his flag on immigration years ago, like you said, like, Trump's been
Hmm.
talking about this for a long time, and because Trump did that when he did, that put the Democrats in a place where they have to be 180 degrees of whatever Trump is.
Hmm.
So, but because Trump was talking about putting up a wall, then that means that when Biden got elected, he had to tear down the wall
Hmm.
just because it was not what Trump wanted.
Yeah, they really had to get all the way on the other side of like every issue. I get this like compilation in my YouTube every now and then of all the people in 2015 who were just so righteously convinced that there's no way that Trump would ever be president.
Yeah.
And it's really good to watch those videos again. I understand there's a partisan element to that. Maybe you're a Democrat or Republican, but like, you have to admit, when you watch these videos of Nancy Pelosi and Tom Hanks and George Clooney say, there's no way Trump will ever become president, count on it, and they say it like direct to camera, that sort of hubris. I mean, it got checked once, but you got to imagine like how much other stuff that they confidently say that is just utter nonsense. Did
But
they
because
believe it
they
when they were saying those things? I
but
don't know.
because they took that hard of a stance, then they now they've played their hand.
Hmm.
And that forces them
Yeah.
into a corner to do what they're doing with the stuff with the border.
Hmm.
And I've always been a pro immigration person, like, because I've always subscribed to that theory of like, yeah, we have declining birth rates, and I'm talking about Canada here more so than the United States, but we have declining birth rates. We have massive amounts of land, massive amounts of natural resources. we have more space, right, than we have people. So let's fill up that space with people. Let's do it. And I'm a believer that the strongest ecosystems are the most diverse ecosystems. So welcoming in people from all over the world, I truly believe that's a strength. I really,
Mhm.
really do. But when you do it as fast as people have been doing it over the past few years, without planning through the infrastructure, like you said, you mentioned the healthcare system. Healthcare system is completely unusable now. The educational system, we're seeing classrooms filled with people of that, you know, these poor kids coming in here and they can barely speak English, and they're being thrown in a class with one teacher and 35 other kids, half of whom can barely speak English. And the poor teacher, like, how is the teacher supposed to be able to handle that? So the transportation system, the housing system, look at housing. The housing is unaffordable for the average Canadian and American. Well, Americans a little bit better, but for the average Canadian, housing is essentially unaffordable. Rents
Mhm.
are out of control in the bigger cities. That's because you threw a bunch of people into the country without planning it through.
Mhm.
Um,
And I think in an open economy, like laissez-faire, you would run into those problems too, but they would resolve themselves a lot quicker because you wouldn't rely on, elections or democracy to like hopefully take care of the issue, right? Because that's what all this stuff tinges on is like you create these problems from over centrally planning things. And then the only chance that you have at overstepping is either you need mass revolutions, you need everybody to unanimously get on board and like kick the government out or like, twinge their hand to get the change, or you need to have, some type of market response eventually. And those, again, because it's all on data, that the central planners can basically say, hey, the data is not supporting us to slow down migration, so we're just going to keep letting it go. And
and
essentially planned economy, it's like all those, it's like wearing a bubble suit, and having like a bunch of things come flying at you. It's like you don't realize the danger because you're in the bubble
yeah,
suit. But
yeah,
if you didn't have that, you would feel the cuts and you'd feel the scrapes and you'd react a lot quicker, right? And so that's what these governments, they always try and sidestep the quick pains, and in order to kind of like smooth everything out. This is why like all these economists, it goes back to Bitcoin, like they're all obsessed with like the volatility of Bitcoin. It's like they can't handle the short-term pain. Oh my God, I see in my comment section. Oh my God, Bitcoin dropped 20%. Oh my God, it went up 40%. It's like long and steady, the thing's fine. You have to eat the swings a little bit. You have to eat the volatility of life. And central planners don't want to do that. And they manipulate things. And it creates this like calcification in like the arteries of a society. And eventually you get a problem that you can't really solve at all. Something
yeah,
has to absolutely get destroyed, built from
yeah.
the ground up, and then you can fix things. And I feel like this is just one of those issues. It's like they're going to keep letting the migrants in, and the birth rates are going to keep dropping. And eventually there's going to be big social unrest over this if there
There
won't
already
already be
is.
this year.
There
So
already is. There already is. It
not
depends
enough to
how
get
you
them to change
measure.
anything, right? Like the big change factor is they let Trump back in, but like nothing's going to change the next 9 months on this. You know, I don't know. Texas leaves the union, maybe. Who knows?
It just goes to show that you can't fix problems using the tools that created the problems in the first place,
Bingo.
right? Like you can't. More red tape is not going to help this. You mentioned about workers coming in here with the accreditations and getting their diplomas to be able to work. Yeah, that's just extra red tape. Housing starts. Like, okay, you bring in a bunch of people into a population. They need places to live, right? They need homes and they need schools and they need hospitals and we need all these things. Well, try energy. We need more, more energy infrastructure or roads. Try starting any of these things. There's
Yeah.
layers and layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy to get anything started in this country. In the United States, a little bit better, but not much.
Hmm.
It's incredibly difficult.
What
More
is
red tape.
nice, and I don't have a story for it teed up, is all the stuff going on in Argentina right now. Like they're complete opposite course. They're privatizing everything there. They're crushing regulations. They're firing all these workers. The unions are pissed down there. Um, but we're gonna see in about a year if all that pays off in some some regard for the population, which is going to be interesting to see. But yeah, I don't have a story for that really fully lined up. All right, let's talk about Bitcoin, because I'm not a immigration expert. I am not an employment expert, but I like to think about these things sometimes. I think it's just part of a what we call like a healthy diet of like consuming and thinking about the world. So ETFs, it's been a while now. Hey, it's like we had this big foreplay for months during 2023. That was all people could talk about.
Felt like
Who's going to
years.
make one? Who's going to get approved? And that was the show forever. And now they're here, and now no one cares. I don't think much has happened that has really surprised me in the way of what's gone on. Maybe I'm forgetting some things, but it's the story's been people are dumping GBTC because of the massive fee. BlackRock's doing well because of the namesake, and then Fidelity's, in close second place. But this week, it's become pretty clear that the GBTC redemptions and the flowing into the other ones has kind of come off a little bit. And I'm curious what you think. If you think, the rate of change of GBTC kind of bleeding out is going to kind of just be maintained, or if you think there will be another wave of people dumping it at some point. But I'm
No,
kind of surprised. I really thought that the GBTC holdings would get cut in half, and that stuff would move pretty quick into Fidelity and BlackRock. But it looks like there's 480,000 Bitcoin worth in grayscale that will maybe bleed out at like another 2,000 or 3,000 a day. But that's slowly diminishing to almost nothing. What do you think?
It's crazy how sticky people are, right? Like they just don't like change, and the difference in fees is it's quite a bit, right? Like the GBTC fee is 1.5%, and BlackRock and Fidelity 1.3 or 0.3%. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in there. So it's pretty significant amount of fees. So you would think that if you're like a rational investor, like you'd be selling off that GBTC as fast as you can and then buying up the cheaper alternative. And we saw that. We definitely did see it at the beginning in the first week, but it's really, really slowed down. I just think it's apathy. Like I think it's just investors don't like change. They just to them 1.3% fees like, oh, okay, whatever. No, and they're not worried about it.
I think another big factor for this is I think they've kind of rooted out the people who got sick of the fees, and now what you're left with is people who have to make the decision between, okay, do I eat the fee or do I eat the tax bill?
The taxes, yes, that's another thing.
That's the big one, right? Like you're going to pay 30% on the cap gains, or do you just continue to eat 1%? I mean, what is a 1.5% in the world of fees when Bitcoin's doing 50% annually? Like maybe that's not a lot, but yeah, I think the question now is like you have this weird situation where ETFs kind of live and die on their volume and their AUM, but they're very distinct factors for the Bitcoin ETFs, where if this holds, GBTC is still going to be by far and away like the biggest ETF for a while. Like I think BlackRock's up to, this chart keeps animating, but I think they're up to like 50 or 60,000 Bitcoin under custody, which is maybe like 1/8 of what GBTC has. And that number is just slowing down. We'll have another wave with Bitcoin, but between all these ETFs, like they hold like what, 5% of the supply. It's not like you're going to see millions of Bitcoin in these ETFs. Across all of them, it's like 700,000. Like the price of Bitcoin is going to have to go to like deep into the 6 digits for these things, I think, to see massive holdings, and that would, that'll be a whole other conversation. Like as the price of Bitcoin goes up, do these ETFs make up a bigger percentage of the supply of Bitcoin? Like, what do you think on that? Do you think it'll be a flywheel where like the more successful Bitcoin is, the bigger the holdings of these ETFs, or do these things kind of have like a cap?
Probably. I just number go up technology, right? Like people and the ETFs are going to be an easy way for people to get into Bitcoin for the first time. So I think we're going to see that when the bull market really gets going. When we break all-time highs, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of new entrants into the market going in on the ETFs instead of buying spot.
So the thing that I question about that is a sovereign wealth fund going to buy Bitcoin through one of these ETFs, or just pay a custodian to hold it on their behalf?
Depends how good the sovereign wealth fund is. I think if the sovereign wealth fund has done their research and really studied this, I think they would buy spot and get a custodial.
Well,
Right? It's
the sovereign wealth
one
funds, like, they don't hold gold ETFs; they just buy gold,
by
right?
just yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. So I would assume so, but I guess it'll depend. One
mhm,
thing I think I asked you, I don't last time we talked, but I don't remember about wash trading.
mhm.
Did the wash trading rules apply to the GBTC and the ETFs?
Like
So
switching between them. Yeah, you
yeah,
asked me
so
that. Yeah.
so
I don't
if you
think so. I never looked it up, but I don't think so. Especially considering like they're different prices, they're different fee structures, they're different QSIPs. I just don't think it would count.
but they're the same underlying asset.
But different quantities of the same underlying asset and different premiums. It's just like I think they're just too different of assets. Like I know that, they're spot Bitcoin ETFs, but like the structure of them is just too different, I think. You have all these other factors you could argue, like they're just not the same. They don't trade the same. There's discrepancies between them. The spreads, for instance.
Well, the spread's not going to
Um,
matter for the people at home listening. Like wash trading is when you're in the United States and in Canada as well too. You're not allowed to have an investment and then sell it and then buy the same thing right away and
mhm,
incur a loss on one, and then you incur a capital gains loss on the things you sell, and then you jump right away into something else that's almost exactly the same thing, right? And then
mhm,
you can claim that on your taxes as a capital loss, and that'll
mhm.
lower your tax burden.
The wash trading laws are not nearly as strict in Canada. I know that versus the US. Like you can do an end of the year sale and then just buy it back in January, and they're fine with that.
Like I know that spot Bitcoin you're fine with the wash in crypto, right? Or where with the other crypto assets, the wash trading rules are pretty laxed, meaning that I don't think there are any wash trading rules. Do your own research, guys. I'm not a
I'll look
I'm
it
not
up
an
for
accountant
sure
person.
this time, though. I still would disagree that they're similar enough. I understand they're Bitcoin trusts, Bitcoin ETFs, but like everything about them is so different. Like Fidelity's BTC fund has very little to do with GBTC. The custodians are
But it's the
different. The
same
fee is
underlying
completely
asset.
different. The
But that
underlying
shouldn't
Bitcoin
matter.
per
The asset itself is the same.
well, the underlying asset is, but the asset is the QSIP, I think. When you fill in a security form for your taxes, you have to list what the security is. They're two different securities. I don't know. I could be wrong. I guess you have to look at the gold ETFs and see if they would apply those
Yeah,
same rules if you're
yeah,
switching between them.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, if that's the case, if the wash trading rules are in effect here, that
mhm,
would explain why we haven't seen that. Why we've seen the GBTC bleed out
mhm.
without seeing a massive amount of people jumping into the ETF,
I
right?
think another thing with GBTC that maybe goes a little underappreciated is like I think Grayscale owns a lot of it, and they're not in any rush to sell it either. Like they're big holders of that fund themselves.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
There's-
All right. Let's talk about mining. So this was really surprising and kind of dropped out of nowhere. And Marty Bent did a really good article on this. The Biden administration, what is it called? The Department of Energy Information Administration, is now going around to Bitcoin miners asking for a whole bunch of data. I'm trying to find what some of them were. Let me just find
the amount of electricity they use, even the models of the
suppliers.
ASICs. That
Yeah, the
yeah, like
unit count,
where
the unit age.
yeah, where you get your electricity. They even want you to literally go to your provider of electricity and let them and figure out what percentage of the total amount of electricity production from your electricity provider is being
Mhm.
used to mine Bitcoin.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So you're a miner. This gets dropped on your head. What do you do? Do you open the mail? Or you just Department of Energy? Oh, didn't see that. What do you
Well,
do?
first of all, they have until the end of July. So
Okay.
they have to provide this data by the end July 31st. So that's 6 months away right off the bat. So a lot can change in 6 months. So
Yeah.
if I'm a miner, the first thing I do is like, okay, let's put it on file. Let's not forget about it, but let's not rush to do it. We'll do it when we have to do it. For a lot of these companies, they provide most of this data already, and they make it public.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find it odd that the administration is coming around asking for this stuff. Maybe for the private miners, like the Bob Burnett from Barefoot Mining, he calls it the horses, right? I don't know if you're aware of that. The rabbits, the horses, and the elephants. So
No, what's that?
the rabbits are the home miners, right? Like me, I have an S9 that's heating my condo right now. So I'm a rabbit. So like I'm not very strong, but I'm hard to catch, right? It's hard to capture the rabbits. The elephants are the publicly traded companies, the publicly traded Bitcoin miners. They're really big. They're massive. They're kind of slow. They're easy to capture because they're so big, right? The elephants, most of this data is pretty easy to get, right? It's the horses, the kind of the in between, the private miners who have maybe a pretty good operation. I don't know a number, maybe 1,000 ASICs. Maybe they're running 1,000 ASICs, something like that. Maybe 500 to 1,000 ASICs. Those type of people, they're not divulging this information because they don't have to, right? They don't have shareholders. They have no reason to tell anybody what's this. I think that this is going after them. It does feel like what happened in Venezuela. Are you aware of what happened in Venezuela with the miners?
The state wanted to like integrate them at some point, and then they changed their mind, and then they chased them out, right?
Yeah. Well, the state essentially wanted them to tag all your mine. They wanted to know where every miner was in the country, and if you were a miner in Venezuela, and if you told them, you thought, okay, they're trying regulation, I'm going to comply, I'm going to do this. Yeah. A year later, 18 months later, knock on your door and they're confiscating your business, right? It feels a little bit like that. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's something else. For any other industry, this is not an issue.
Yeah.
Nobody cares.
They are getting by with just such an amazing amount of misinformation in the way that they prosecute these people, because the general population just has like no skin in this game. There's no reason for the average person to give a shit about how mining works and whether or not, electricity use should be regulated or controlled by the state. There's just no interest in that at all. And so the problem is that every 4 years we get flushed with cash. Everyone feels rich once every 4 years. But if you're going to have a long-term operation, in getting legislation done through the government, you have to have lobbying on your side in some capacity. And so you get like Satoshi Action Fund, and they're doing great work on a state level. And you get a couple other lobbying organizations in DC. But ultimately, there's no voice of the people that really explain these things. And then even the people who are pretty receptive to mining, let's just call them like Ted Cruz in Texas, and Texas, in general is pretty good at understanding this and talking about it. It's like you get one voice out of 100, the other 80 senators or 350 congressmen and women, they don't know anything about it. So the easiest thing to do is just to pitch the fear factor. Elizabeth Warren is getting away with murder, the type of stuff that she's putting out. It feels like the only thing that keeps her in check is community notes. Essentially, that's it, right?
Well, you know as well as I do, understanding Bitcoin is incredibly difficult. It takes a lot of time to understand Bitcoin. It takes even more time to understand Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining is in itself a completely, there's a lot to learn. And for a lot of these politicians and bureaucrats as well, they don't have the time to understand this stuff. Right. And I'm somewhat understanding of that. Like I get it, like a little bit, but to come at everything really hard, to think that every problem deserves a hammer without taking a step back. And like you said, who knows how much of this is Ted Cruz in Texas. Generally speaking, the Republican states are a little bit more receptive to this stuff. So therefore, the Democratic states are like, they got to go against it without even studying it. They just see this as, oh, this is a Republican thing. So
Yeah, exactly. Just like
it's
we
bad.
said, top of the show, it's just like
So,
everything's got to be staunchly opposed if the opposition loves it.
but there is stuff out there. Like without divulging too much, I do work in this a little bit, and there is some work being done. And I think it's on us as Bitcoiners to spread this as much as we possibly can. KPMG came out with a report this summer. It's called Bitcoin's ESG. Bitcoin is an ESG imperative. And KPMG, like you send this to a politician, you send this to a high-ranking bureaucrat, they're going to respect that name, right? Big Four, big whatever, the consulting firm, big whatever. And it's a very well done report. And I've been spreading that report around all over the place. I've probably sent that to 24 people, 36 people at work. Crickets. Nothing in response, right? Like nobody wants to take the time to read the report, which is really well done and well laid out and simple. They'd rather just, listen to whatever the TV's telling them to think. And okay, if Trump thinks this is a good thing, then it must be a bad thing.
Well, I'm going to put my optimist hat on here for a second, because as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about this. I think the biggest advocate probably for Bitcoin mining on a federal level, not that we as Bitcoiners should care. Like, we're going to keep hashing. If they don't want us in this country, we're just going to move, or we'll find ways to do it off grid. But for the people who do care about what the federal government thinks about Bitcoin mining, I think the biggest advocates really are going to be the electricity companies.
Of course.
That seems to be a train that's really pushing forward. They're all finding ways to use that waste energy. And so eventually, with their extra profits, they're going to be the lobbyers, and they're going to pay for the lobbying stuff to make sure that sticks.
But in this country, the ties between the electricity production companies, I use that in quotations, companies, they're largely government entities.
In Canada,
right?
Yeah.
In Canada. In the United States, it's a little bit better, but it's still, the ties between the electric companies and the governments are still quite strong in the United States.
Well, we're a nation of followers in that regard, though. And I think because it is more private in the US, once those companies get on board, we'll take a second look up here. But I mean, you already have, like, in Alberta, I mean, that is like the Bitcoin mining province. So they get that. So you just need a little bit of Alberta to rub off, in Parliament at some point.
Do you happen to know those? You know the numbers on that? I don't. I've never looked at that. Like hash rate by province.
I don't know hash rate by province, but I mean, just Hut 8 being there is kind of their main places.
Yeah, but we got Bitfarms in Quebec as well, right? Like I would venture to say, I bet you there's more hash coming out of Quebec than Alberta.
That's fair. That's fair. And then you got all the nuclear stuff. We won't be able to get to that on time, but that's next. All the excess from that at some point. But yeah, it's interesting. I just, we as Bitcoiners, it's like you get something like this where you get this big article and the first impulse is like, oh my God, the state, like, fuck, they're coming down on us. And then you realize, you take a deep breath and you realize you don't have to respond to them right away. And all this is going to fade away at some point.
Yes. And a lot of the stuff they're asking is out there anyway.
If they don't want us here, we just move, right?
Well, I mean, I don't want to move. I mean, I think
the miners, the mining companies. No, I mean, you're going to be a home miner forever. They're never going to come for home mining.
I agree.
But I mean, like, what are they going to do? They're going to take apart your home heater, your crypto cloaks thing, and be like, oh, there's a hash board in there.
Yeah.
Go to jail.
But
now that I say that out loud, that doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility for the Trudeau government. But
I want a decentralized mining industry. I want it spread out as much as possible, geographically as well, right? I don't want, and maybe there is too much mining in the US right now. Maybe it is a good thing that maybe it's not necessarily a good thing that the government's coming down on these people, but maybe a little bit of some of these these bigger mining companies will be like, you know what? Because of this and other things that I'm seeing in the news from the US government, I'm going to open up something in Mexico, or I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there and expand a little bit more globally. Maybe that's a good thing.
Let me ask you something. The story of the last 2 years is like, screw the price. The hash rate just goes up forever.
Yeah.
How much of that hash rate is being bought from essentially just issuances of stock and options from the public miners? I think a ton of it has. Essentially, I think if you didn't have such a crazy fiat credit system, you wouldn't see hash rate keep ripping. I mean, where's the money to do it? It's just not affordable. But if you're doing it on other people's dime and through dilution, you just keep buying miners and miners and miners. Like, I think that's where all the liquidity is for all these ASICs. I don't think it exists naturally without the ability to just issue stock.
Well, the first thing is how much hash is being produced by publicly traded miners, and I think it's around 60% of the total hash.
Really, I didn't know it was that much.
I think it's
There
around
you
60.
go. Holy smokes. So that's I don't know. To me, that's a definitive answer. Every single one of these companies has diluted
I could be wrong
to
on that.
buy more miners. Every single one.
I mean, the biggest culprit of that was Core Scientific, and they fuck around. They found out, right? So,
Hey, they're
but
going
yeah,
back. I think they're back on the
yeah,
NASDAQ now. Isn't that crazy?
yeah, they're back. They're back.
Crazy. Yeah.
But
But
it's a business, right? Like Bitcoin mining is a business.
mhm.
And if you have access to cheap money, you think it's worthwhile, and you're bullish on this thing, and you can get money from the public, then yeah, like you do it.
Yeah.
I
Anyways,
don't know.
we'll wrap it up. I think this stuff will come to pass. I don't think it implicates
I
much on
agree.
the industry. I would love it if
I
we
agree.
could have some more serious conversations between politicians on it rather than like you'll see a dumb tweet or a congressional hearing with very biased people. I'd love for this to become an eventual election topic. I know that was like the promise of Vivek's campaign was to make it a topic, and it's not going to happen this year, at least on a federal level. But I hope some of these states, maybe something going on in Texas, they can start having real conversations about the impact of Bitcoin mining. Maybe that's
Just
a
be
20.
intellectually honest about it.
Yeah.
Just be intellectually honest about it. And if there's a reason to be against it, then be against it. That's fine. But if you're
Mhm.
honest, if you spend a few hours to study this thing, you've talked to a few people, and now you disagree with me, I can respect that.
Mhm.
That's fine. I can talk to you. But it's just
Mhm.
this knee-jerk reaction to just say it's bad and then end it at that.
Yeah.
It's boiling the oceans. It's using too much water. It's whatever whatever one. Like each transaction cost $50,000. Whatever.
Mhm. More than the country of Argentina.
More than the country of Argentina or the
Yeah,
Netherlands
yeah.
is the one that you see all the time, right? Just
Mhm.
be intellectually honest about it. And
Yeah.
I'm not seeing that. And it uses coal. Like I hear that one all the time. Like they're buying
Well,
up
it
coal.
does.
Like what? Sure, but like nobody. No publicly traded miner is buying up coal to burn it to mine Bitcoin that I know of. Now there
There is
might be,
one
well,
in Philly, I think.
yeah, a stronghold,
Harold?
stronghold, right?
Stronghold, yeah.
Stronghold, but that's a little bit different. They're using like waste coal. So they're digging up.
Everything is waste. Everything is like it's the dung beetle. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
always
yeah,
there's always that catch, yeah. It's using natural gas, flared natural gas,
yeah.
waste coal. Yeah. All right. We'll wrap it up. We'll get into this conversation next week too. I want to kind of see, I want to talk a little bit more about mining. You know, I think a lot more about it than I do in energy infrastructure, and it's something I'd love to dive into sometime. Thanks everyone for watching. Really appreciate it. Getting back into the rhythm of things. I thought today's show was pretty good. If you liked it, give the video a thumbs up. And yeah, any last words, Boomer?
Yeah, go and follow me on Twitter. Follow Julian
Yes.
as well. Interact with us. We want to hear. Last week, it was 2 weeks ago, the last time we spoke, I got a little bit of feedback, and that's awesome. Like, so any type of feedback, like Julian and I were
Yeah.
talking about this today. These shows that we do on Friday afternoons, they're really practice for us, and we really
Mhm.
we want to get better at this, right? We want to
Yeah.
learn. So anything that you guys, if you're listening to this, if you've made it right all the way to the end, just send a message, leave a comment, and help us try to get better.
Yep. Yeah, we're here to get reps, and eventually I'll be a pro live anchor. But I really like just talking about this and sharing with the community. So appreciate all you guys. Take care. Have a great weekend.